Hi, my name is Frankie. Thank you for listening to My Mom. I never listen.
Erin Barzilai from Her Hoop Stats. If you haven't subscribed, it's been around since 2017, and shame on you if you haven't. And Charlie Creme, who's the man of the hour right now, he's the guy that's on the tip of everyone's tongue as we head into Selection Monday. So, Charlie, tournaments are still going on, and every day you're putting out an update. What's today's update as we sit here on Wednesday with the Big Ten tournament still going on as one of the power leagues, the Big 12 tournament going on, and a few other tournaments going on at the same time?
Well, and those tournaments, the two big ones you mentioned, aren't having too much of an impact on things. Michigan State is kind of just on the good side of the last four in, so they still need to win. So that it's important from that perspective. Some teams can help their seeds a little bit. Maybe Iowa with a nice run could bump up. I still think Rutgers could get into the top on the top four seed lines overall if they have a nice run. I mean, that's a team obviously that's really on the rise. Same for Michigan, perhaps. The best team in the Big Ten, Maryland, I think is kind of stuck on the two line. They're just teams ahead of them are just kind of blocking them, no matter what they do. The bubble itself is the American Conference is really kind of driving the bus now. Houston is among the first teams out, and UCF is among the last teams in. I think Houston at this point, the way it kind of shakes, they're going to have to win the tournament to get the automatic bid. But I think UCF can still get into the field with a trip to the finals. So there's a lot going on in that tournament and kind of how things are shaping up there. A lot of the other bubble teams are done. So it's not really they can't help themselves. They just are hoping somebody else doesn't hurt them. One peripheral bubble team that might really help themselves is Oklahoma in the Big 12. So that's a tournament to keep an eye on too. If they can make a nice little run, because if they do, they're going to pick off a couple of highly regarded teams, and that's going to give them some more quality wins that'll help build their resume and maybe get in this year where things are obviously a little bit more open. One of the things I like to remind people of is that with no Ivy League champion in the tournament, the Ivy League obviously not playing this year, and no Ohio State, who took themselves out with the self-imposed ban of the postseason this year. Those two, we have two other teams in the field right now to take spots that aren't there. So there's, as I said, it's a little bit more open than maybe in years past.
So it's such an exciting time, right? And Erin, when you look at the women's game and the way you got involved and your idea to create some analytics around our game that actually could be measurable and things that could help grow the game, you've got your podcast, you got your newsletter, and then you've got your website that has incredible detailed information. When you look at the women's tool, the net that they're using, why aren't we using Her Hope Stats instead?
Well, that was the dream when we started in 2017-18. That was always on my radar. The men's side, they had been using the kind of six metrics. I know the committee was reviewing those before the net came out. I do think, and I am not offended by this, right, that the NCAA kind of felt like they wanted to, quote unquote, own the metric, right? Like if they were going to use it, like it should really be what they wanted. They should know everything that's in there. And so they didn't really want to rely on outside parties. I mean, they're pretty well established on the men's side, and I'd like to think we're pretty well established on the women's side. But the NCAA has been around for how many years, and we've only been around since 2000. For the 2017-18 season. So I can totally respect that. I will say that I do feel good that our Her Hoop Stats rating is, quite similar, not surprisingly, because we have a lot of the same outlook and same techniques. Not 100% the same, but very similar. So, for instance, we're both very high on Baylor. The Her Hoop Stats rating has them third in the country, and so does the net. Similarly, South Carolina is fourth in both. So, not surprisingly, if kind of teams do well, statistically, they would do well on a number of systems. And so one benefit of that, right, is that we therefore give a little bit of insight into something that is like the net beyond the history of the net itself. And so I think that can be pretty insightful for staffs, teams, as they're trying to kind of map out what would happen. And as we work to add more historical data, I think that'll be a little more valuable to say, hey, this is what the net would have said, or something like the net would have said for the 2015 tournament or something like that.
Without getting into too much math, because I don't want to be, trying to figure out all these other mathematical algorithms or equations or anything, but both of you guys have some sort of math background to what you do and the way you approach the game, because it is about some numbers and about putting numbers together and trying to figure out, if you put these numbers together, what's the best opportunity for this team to win, or what's the offensive efficiencies of this team. And I love it. I think it's an important tool in measuring the growth of our game. So when you look at some of the math that's involved in bracketology, Charlie, when you look at what your background is and how you've gotten to this point, just kind of share with us like where you were and how all of a sudden you've become Charlie Buckets or whatever we want to call you, that this time of year you're on TV all the time.
Yes, well, the history of bracketology goes back quite a ways, and Joe Lenardi is really kind of the godfather of the whole enterprise. But I was with him in the beginnings of, or how it came to be, and really bracketology was a product of a mistake. We were working for Blue Ribbon College Basketball Yearbook at the time, which in the day was a hard copied 350 page text only preview guide to the men's college basketball season. He decided it would be a great idea to do a tournament supplement, which this is pre-internet here, folks. So a lot of you listening are going to have no idea what I'm talking about. That sounds more like dinosaur time than reality. But there was a time before the internet when you got things in the mail and you opened them up and you read them. And that was what the tournament guide was going to be. It was similar to the preview guide, and it was all text. It was very detailed, but it had to be turned around very quickly. Well, the second year we did it, and obviously to turn around quickly, you've got to write a lot of these teams ahead of time. Well, we're watching the selection show on, I think, the second year, I believe it was 1995. And all of a sudden, Manhattan and Santa Clara popped up on the board, two teams that we did not foresee getting at large bids and did not have a plan for. Steve Nash played for that Santa Clara team. So I often say that Steve Nash is to blame for bracketology, because then Joe and I had to rush and go get those teams written so they could get to the printer on time so that everybody could get their guide on time. And after it was all said and done, we took a deep breath. Joe looked at me and said, that's never going to happen again. I have to be better at forecasting. So he really delved into the process, really immersed himself in it. And I was kind of with him when he did. And from that, he said, hey, there's something here. He started, now the internet came into being. He started his own website. Eventually ESPN bought that website, hired him. And then a few years later, they decided that they wanted to add this sort of content to women's college basketball. He didn't have any kind of background in women's college basketball. I did to some degree in some of my other jobs besides writing for Blue Ribbon College Basketball Yearbook. And they offered me he gave them my name. I jumped at the opportunity to do it, and it just sort of took off from there. And both on Joe's side with the men and with what I do on the women's side, it's really evolved. It's become a much bigger thing than it was back in the early 2000s. And I'm very grateful for that. I appreciate the game for what it's given me, and I hope I've given something back to the game to make it better. And it's been nothing but fun. But that's sort of the history and a quick synopsis of bracketology. Again, Steve Nash, blame him.
Aaron, give us your background, because you didn't start on the women's side, and you obviously have a lot going on with your NBA work and some of your high-level analytic work. Can you kind of give everyone an understanding of who you are and why they need to be subscribing to Her Hoop Stats?
Sure. Yeah. I've always loved math and always loved basketball. I went to MIT undergrad. I was actually on the team. We were Division III and not very good. So I like to say I practiced more than I played basketball in college. But, the MIT team has done amazing things on the men's side since then. And as you probably know, Sonia Rahman has now moved over from being the MIT women's coach to an assistant coach with the Memphis Grizzlies. And so I've always kind of followed math, didn't really think of basketball as a potential career, but then sort of learned about the kind of Moneyball movement in basketball and in the NBA. And so I started out, as you said, working on the NBA side. I had a sort of public NBA website. I followed the women's game a little bit, like when I was in grad school and college. I was at Stanford. I was there when like Kate Pay was playing. Kate Starbird, so many great players. But definitely, sort of as I was focusing more on the NBA, I definitely have a hole in my kind of understanding of the history of the women's game and all the great names from, in the sort of 2000s and early 2010s. But, I worked, eventually I was the analytics guy for the Memphis Grizzlies for about 4 years, doing work kind of on the NBA side. And then I was the director of basketball analytics for the Philadelphia 76ers. So I was part of their front office. And, in doing so, kind of learned a lot about how basketball is kind of analyzed, I'd say, inside teams, right? And with that experience, once my time with the Sixers was up, I was thinking about kind of projects to do and what kinds of things I want to do to stay in the game. And fast forward, a friend of mine who I'd worked with when I was at the Sixers became the video coordinator for the Lady Vols, and so he reached out to me and said, "Hey, look, I'm used to having access to all this information on the men's side. Is there anything you could recommend on the women's side?" And so I looked around a little bit, and frankly, didn't feel like there was. And frankly, I was quite surprised. I remember Sue Bird had written that article in the Players Tribune, sort of as a call to arms, really asking for this kind of information that we have on our site. And I was surprised that no one had really put it together. So I said, "Hey, this could be a great opportunity to take advantage of my skills." I thought sort of the women's game was very interesting, and had fond memories of it, as I said, from my time at Stanford. And so, with the role models of the people doing this kind of work on the men's side, I said, why don't we have the parity of information? And so that's really, what I did. So it started out, my goal was to kind of be the Ken Pom / basketball reference for women's basketball. I knew that I wanted to do it, as part of a team, so it's definitely not just me. There's so many people that work on her hoop stats and have helped grow it really over time. But, one of our number one goals was just to make the information easily accessible and easily organized, especially back around 2017. If you wanted to look up UConn stats or compare a player from UConn and Oregon, like the format of the website was totally different. You just couldn't sort of systematically, take a look at how all the players were doing, how the teams were doing. And so our first goal is really just kind of organize the information. So we have all the traditional stats people are used to. We have all the advanced stats that are common on the men's side, stats like effective field goal percentage, offensive rebounding rate, things like that, things like control for opportunity. And then one thing I think we do that's quite valuable is that we're not just giving you the numbers, we're also telling you the ranks of the players and the percentiles of the players and teams, right? So you can see not just that they're have a number that we all think is high, and we have a sense of like a 20-point scorer is a lot. We don't really know where a 15-point scorer ranks in the grand scheme of things, and so we can tell you, oh, they're 80th percentile in the country, and we have that information not just for Division 1, but also for Division 2 and Division 3, because really our goal is to unlock better insight about the women's game, and we're doing that. We started with the stats site, and then, as you said, we realized that there was so much more that we can do. And one thing I learned, working with teams, is basketball is so much more than a spreadsheet, right? There's so many great stories to tell. You can't just, I would not recommend making the bracket, for instance, purely on an algorithm. I think you really need to have that human element to factor in the things that we try to capture in the math but can't. And so, in the same way, there's lots of great stories, and we wrote. We began with our newsletter articles. And so, for instance, today we just put out our Becky Hammond Mid-Major Player of the Year 5 finalist list. And then over time, we've added a podcast, we've added some video live streaming. So, really just trying to do our part to cover the game the way it's meant to be covered.
Well, I've known Alex Varlin, is who you're referencing,
yes.
with the Balls, and Alex called me and said, "Hey, I've got a buddy of mine. His name is Aaron, and he's got this idea. Would you just talk to him?" And I'm like, an MIT guy wants to talk to me? What is wrong with that? That sounds like that doesn't make any sense. But that's, I remember you and I speaking. I remember exactly where I was when we spoke, and I remember you thinking, I'm going to do this. I'm going to charge people $20. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's $20 for a subscription to get that kind of information and to be able to have that kind of access. That is going to help our game. And if anybody is not subscribing to Her Hoop Stats for $20, it's a wealth of information. I get the emails, I get everything that you put out, and I think it's really helped our game. And just to stay on this, when you look at an NC State with a 70, I don't remember the number right now, but like 77% of their defensive rebounding percentage, is 77% of the time they're on defense, they rebound. Okay. So how you describe that, or I would describe that on the air, is I would break it down like, well, it's part of the way that they defend. The ball screen action, they're always under. It's the way they play on defense. They're not up the line and overplaying. So when I get a number like that, it is an immediate indicator to me of a couple of defensive philosophies that I can look for when I'm studying film on a team to build a tendency that I think I can share with the viewer. So I try to take that number and turn it into some sort of picture that they can understand. That's what I do with it.
I think that's so important, right? As I said, you can't just be about kind of throwing out these numbers. We sort of joke about, we don't want things to just be an eye chart, right? That people are staring at and trying to make sense of, and it makes as much sense together as an eye chart. I think that sort of understanding that context, to me, really the numbers, can really help you understand why. So where you can go sort of do that film analysis. And, in my mind, they often ask a lot of questions. They raise a lot of questions as you really dig into it. It's like, oh, okay, so a team's great at offensive rebounding. Why is that? And that's when you go really dig in. Here's a player that's high volume, but not really that efficient a shooter. And so, when we control for the value of 2s and 3s, and so let's, watch their film. Are they taking a bunch of, spinning, step back, kind of off balance shots where they should be passing off? But one thing I do want to make sure that I communicate to is I think, that, a lot of the math that's underlying these stats that we have on our site that people might be less familiar with is actually quite simple. They're usually just fractions with a slightly different denominator. We all understand what points per game are, right? That's not hard. People don't tend to think about points per minute, but it's actually really a little more relevant because it helps control for players that are playing, in the low 20s versus someone that's playing 35 minutes a game. And so, it's not just the points per game, but kind of how much they're scoring per minute. And then the other thing that happens is the pace of the game. Some teams like Troy are just ridiculously fast, and then others are much slower. And so you might be on a team that's only going up and down the floor 60 times. And so naturally, you're not going to score as many points as a player there as you would on a high pace program.
Yeah, and Deb, just to jump in, and your point about NC State and a stat that I would immediately go to Aaron's site for. So I'm watching the game on Sunday, and my big observation, I think we're about 3 minutes left in the first half, and there had been one offensive rebound in the entire game. So I was like, this is odd. Let me go look. How odd is it? So I pull up herhoopstats.com and I look, and then I see that NC State rebounds 77% of the missed shots that their opponents throw up. And I'm like, okay, it's odd, yes, still, but not that odd. This is what NC State does, and it's observational, and now it's numerical, and I can put the two together, and it completely makes sense.
That was a great example of exactly the way I do it too, Charlie. It's very similar when I'm looking up things on the website or I'm checking out, some information. We're fortunate that Aaron now can put out, as we get to the NCAA tournament and in the postseason, we get a report from Her Hoop Stats on a couple of really important things with certain matchups that will come out once the bracket is released. But before we get to the bracket being released, Charlie, when you're looking at the net versus the RPI that we've used in the past. So I've been saying that there's 3 things this year that are new for the women's tournament. One is that we have the net tool. The second is we're going to all be in one spot in San Antonio. I know the pandemic forced us to be there. However, I am thrilled that we're going to get a chance to have some data to take a look at. And the third thing is the most important part of this, I think, is the S-curve, the way teams are going to be seated, because with geography being taken out of the mix now, we're going to get a true mathematical S, 1 place 64, 2 place 63, etc. And I think the game, the coaches, the players, the product has grown to a point where we should have an S curve and remove geography as a component in our game. So what have you seen that makes you think that the S curve is, that the committee's going to get it right? Like, how do you know the committee's going to get it right?
Well, it takes an element out, so it makes it easier, right? And there's always that with that geography element to it, and trying to keep teams from traveling and simplifying travel. You're always I'm fighting myself because I'm like you. I would rather see a tournament that has a truer seed value laid out in the bracket. But I know that's part of it, or has been part of it. So that's why I'm glad we're having those conversations this year, because every year that seems to what we funnel down to when we're talking about seeds or placement in the bracket, trying to explain why the placement is what it is, and it's pretty much based on geography. Not even just geography; it's just can a team get on a bus and travel versus having to get on a plane? And on it, that's the determining factor is how teams are placed in the bracket in what has been a typical year. So I'm excited about this. Honestly, it's made my job a little bit easier. Picking the 64 is still painstaking. And actually, that's harder this year. But when I get to the bracketing part, the only thing I'm worried about as I'm going through the S curve is on the top 4 lines in particular, is keeping teams from the same conference separated as best as possible. So there's going to be some instances where it probably won't be a pure S curve this year, because you got to move some teams. Like for instance, if there turns out to be 3 Pac-12 teams in the top 16 teams, they have to be separated by rule. They have to be separated all on the first 4 lines. It might not exactly work out, but it's going to be really close and a far greater facsimile to a true balance than what we've had in the past. So I have relished that, especially when we get down to some of the lower seeds, instead of having to worry about is Stephen F. Austin, are they really going to send him to play in South Beach? No, they probably won't. Okay, so I got to move them because it's more likely they're going to go to Oklahoma instead, and it makes plotting out the rest of the bracket a lot easier. And the net, I think there's been some talk about it. There's been some complaints about it a little bit. But I'll say this: it's better. It's not what I think anybody would consider perfect. I don't think there is, and maybe Aaron could correct me on this, but I don't know that there's a perfect metric that is going to meet everybody's exact standard of what they think. However, if you looked at the RPI this year, you'd see some crazy things because of the reduction of games. So it's a much better thing that we have the net, and it came just in time.
Yeah. And I would say, following up on that, this is a tough year for the net, for our Hoop Stats rating. Without the mixing of games, there's so many fewer non-conference games, so it's really hard to tell, when a team like SFA dominates, but they didn't have the opportunity to play a couple good non-conference teams, or as many opportunities that they might have, to see just how good they are. And so, but yeah, I 100% agree. There's no way to do it perfectly. Our metrics right now are all kind of team-based, and the injury question is really interesting. I think that, as you work on this and try to build these metrics, you really start to get into some fascinating philosophical questions, I think, around, like, what should you do if a player on like Oregon, right, has a key injury, right? Like, what does that do to them? South Dakota with Maya Selland, right? And so, do you really want the teams in the tournament that are the best now going forward? And so it's a little more straightforward to build, I think, metrics that are just, almost like for gamblers, right? Just predicting what are the odds that anyone's going to win, what's the score, as opposed to kind of looking back and trying to control, because there's just, you try to have as much information as possible, but you're never going to have as much information as people. And I know the committee, does spend an inordinate amount of time. Like, everybody loves to complain about them. I went to a mock selection exercise that they did where they were kind of educating coaches and media. It was back in 2018 in Indianapolis. And so, they talked about the process, about how they're monitoring, all the games and all the conferences assigned to different conferences, really collecting a lot of information that we don't quite have in a systematic way yet.
Yeah, I've always wanted an in-conference RPI or some sort of metric for the unbalanced schedules, especially in the Power 5 or 6. To take a look at the different teams inside their own leagues, just to see if they are truly teams that should or shouldn't be on the bubble or in the discussion. So let's get to that point here where we can talk about a couple of teams, Charlie, because I know there's a lot of sleepless nights out there, and there's a lot of coaches that are just hanging on, the possibility of, did they do enough? What criteria is the committee really looking at? There's so many different bullet points for them, or criteria for them to evaluate on teams. And what you want is, like in officiating, you want a consistent approach to the game. If they're going to call this foul on the East Coast, they should be calling that foul on the West Coast. And then when it comes to picking the teams, can you see some sort of trend in your analysis and the data that you have that will help some of these coaches, like the last 4 in, DePaul, Wake Forest, Mississippi State, UCF, or the first 4 out right now, Notre Dame, Ole Miss, Houston, BYU? I mean, those are the teams to me that I look at and I go, wow, you're just hoping that you can hang on, or you're just hoping something happens that allows you to have a chance. What have you seen?
Well, it's this is a difficult year as far as that is concerned, because there haven't been enough games to compare it to something historically, is normal. There's also, and I get this question all the time, so I might as well throw it in there. Is the COVID factor? And people ask me, well, people making their pitch for certain teams, or even some coaches are making their pitch. This happened to our program as it related to COVID, or that happened. Coach missed a couple games, couple starters out this game. We didn't get to practice for 2 weeks, and that's all of that is hard to put into the urn and churn up and come out with something that would be that's not so highly subjective that it takes away from it takes away from a real objective conversation about it. I think everybody's dealt with something on some level, and they're all going to think that it was the worst thing in the world to happen to their program at the time. So it's hard to measure that, but there probably are certain elements that have to be taken into consideration. But I think to get it back to kind of what this season meant in terms of the kind of the numbers and the analysis and things like that, and some of these bubble teams, it's something that keeps me up at night. Teams like DePaul have me really puzzled for a couple of reasons. If you look at their numbers, not good, right? And net now in the low 70s. Strength of schedule kind of iffy. Don't have a lot of big wins. Have a couple. We're real competitive with some good teams, even if they didn't win early in the season. Have some really bad losses here at the end of the season. The thing that kind of throws me a little bit is the fact that in the first reveal for the top 16 teams that the committee gave us, DePaul was not in it, but they were a team mentioned that the committee had under consideration, which would essentially put DePaul probably in the top 24 in the minds of the committee. And at that point, I had already had them kind of sliding. Well, I had to, because my job essentially is to try to predict or mimic what I think the committee will do. Ultimately, I had to kind of slide DePaul back up. And I wonder how the committee is going to view a team like that at the time they viewed very more highly than I did, but now is really doesn't look like the part. So that's why I still have them in, because I obviously the committee seemed to value considerably what was going on in the earlier part of the season with DePaul. Wake Forest is another one. There are a lot of good wins, more than any of the other kind of last four in type teams we're talking about. But overall record is still a criteria, and they're just 12-12. And obviously there are factors that go into that too. But that is the number. And Wake Forest didn't finish very strong. They lost 4 of 5 to finish their season. That win against North Carolina in the ACC tournament was, it turns out, I think, an absolute necessity for their case, because then they would be talking about having a sub 500 record. So things like that I'm churning with the balance of a team's resume, because there's when you're talking about bubble teams, there's plenty of bad. There's usually more than one element of good. So how does that factor into those conversations that those 10 people are having in that room in a couple of days, and which point of view on the criteria is going to win out in their debates and their discussion? And that's the part that's that's the struggle of the bubble for a bracketologist. And sometimes I quote unquote get it wrong. Sometimes I get it right. Sometimes I think I got it right and they got it wrong. And there might be some of that this year, but there's so much more subjectivity to it this year. I am, let's just say I'm a little less confident in everything that I'm doing and saying, because I don't know how some of the non-criteria factors with COVID are going to play in.
Aaron, what do you think about some of the teams that Charlie has that are last 4 in or first 4 out? How about like the discussion about Mississippi State and Ole Miss? When you look at those two teams out of the SEC, Mississippi State right now would be a last 4 in, which to me, based on the way you have it, looks like it'd be like number 63.
Yes.
And Ole Miss would be like number 66, the way Charlie has it listed. There, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm actually just pulling up my our compare resume tool. It actually kind of helps I make this have some insight into that, right? So I can look at the fact we have their her hoop stats rating roughly the same. They're both, Mississippi State's 52nd, Ole Miss is 54th. And yeah, when you look at their, one thing I like to do is kind of put their schedules side by side, because like in this case, Mississippi State's 10-9 against Division I teams. And Ole Miss is 11-11. So like you can actually look at all that information. It's not so much that'll fry your brain. And so Ole Miss has got those two wins against Kentucky, whereas Mississippi State has the win against Georgia. When you really look at their performance, one thing I like to do is we kind of stack it up from like how are they performing on the best against the best opponents all the way down to the worst, because I think that when we're talking about the NCAA tournament in particular, what really matters is more so like how you're going to do against other NCAA tournament teams. And so I can see just looking at this, and if you want, I can share my screen, that there's a little more green on the Ole Miss side of things. The Arkansas win's also very impressive. Interestingly, Mississippi State kind of starts dominating the competition with their win against Ole Miss. One thing that my philosophy, which I don't know, certainly probably the committee doesn't share, I don't know if you guys do, is to me that head-to-head game, it's only one data point, right? It's one out of roughly 20. And so I don't tend to give to really overrate that, especially that game was a 60-56 game. And so, it's really not fair to say that, Mississippi State's clearly better than Ole Miss, right? If they play that game 100 times, maybe this means that Mississippi State would win, based on that score, Mississippi State would win 55 of them, right? But we don't really know. It's just a single observation, as we would say, on the data side. So I mean, looking at this, I would probably give Ole Miss a slight edge. One other team I wanted to bring up, I'd be curious to hear what you guys think, is BYU, right? They split in the regular season, I think, against Gonzaga, and then, we're 0.6 seconds away from winning the automatic bid yesterday in a spectacular game. And so, I think it's really interesting to think about their case. I think they're first four out on your list, I saw, Charlie, and
yes.
What are the chances we can get them in?
Yeah. Well, here's something interesting about BYU, because they've been a team too. Their resume is largely based on the good of their resume is largely based on that win over Gonzaga. They beat LSU earlier in the year, and there's not a lot in between. And I guess the issue that I had with them is their league is not very good. So and then this year it's really hard to you hate to say that, because teams didn't have the chance as much to go outside their league and sort of prove their mettle against maybe some more of the Power 5 type conferences. But I think there are still 10 humans in that room, and I'm a human, and I'm watching that game yesterday, and Gonzaga is so depleted, and BYU had such an opportunity, and as far as I'm concerned, they blew it. You can't score 42 points in a championship game against a team who's relying largely on a freshman who's played 6 minutes a game during the regular season to do a lot of your scoring down the stretch, and not pick up a win in that game, and not actually win that game going away. So I think if it's not one data point, and I totally agree with you on the how head-to-head thing. We have to kind of measure that a little bit in the way we do things. However, I look at it as that's a marquee game. It's a game that everybody on the committee was watching. That I was certainly watching, riveted because it was so close, but stunned at how amazingly bad it was from an offensive standpoint. Deb, I'm sure if you watched that game, you probably had to put a blindfold on, because
I had the same garbage can in my hands that Joe Townsend was holding on to, actually.
And I think so my big takeaway was that this was a team who had an opportunity, and they completely let it slip through their fingers. I don't know. I can't bring myself to certainly move them up after that game, even though it was so close, and Gonzaga is an NCAA tournament team and is a very good team, but that wasn't the true Gonzaga, and they still could not get the win. So that's where maybe the human element comes in, or the observational element comes.
One quick follow up on that, since you're basically doing bracketology every day, much like the committee. Given that it's Wednesday today as we're recording this, by the time Sunday and Monday rolls around, like does Wednesday and the game from some of the power tournaments over the past weekend, do they seem like an eternity ago in the same way that we're all feeling that for the past year? Or does it still stay top of mind, the reaction you had today from watching that yesterday?
I still think when BYU comes around to the conversation, that game's going to flood back into people's minds, and then you start looking deeper into more of the analytics. Okay, all right, well, what did BYU do? And it's like, I guess I had them in the field for a long time, because in watching them, I thought they do play a real efficient, for the most of the time, offensive game. They're certainly well coached, and they mostly dominate. Other than Gonzaga, they mostly dominate the rest of that conference. They had one really bad loss after they beat Gonzaga in the regular season, and that really set them back as well. And that made me kind of reevaluate my thinking. But there's not. I mean, from a data standpoint, from a win standpoint, there's not a ton there. So I was using my eyes and thinking, yeah, this team can compete with tournament level teams. That's why I have them in. And then I see kind of a regression from that, and that's where I sort of pull back on them. So I do wonder the same thing. That's a very good observation by you, Aaron. Is what's going to happen on Saturday and Sunday? Is BYU, that WCC final from 4 or 5 days ago, really going to resonate as much as it maybe resonates with us right now? And I think maybe there's an element to that, but I think, as I said, once you get back to BYU in the conversation, I think people's minds are going to go back to, they scored 42 points in a championship game when the other team had most of their regulars sitting on the bench or sitting somewhere else.
3 starters were affected by the stomach flu or the stomach bug, whatever you would like to call it, for Gonzaga. Yeah, and one other team I want to ask you guys about, and then whatever you want to talk about, Notre Dame, and where they sit and what you think about their chances.
Notre Dame, another one of those teams. I mean, most years, any team on the bubble I'm kind of in that constant internal wrestling match. I don't love the way they finished. They've got some decent wins. Certainly, they competed pretty well in the ACC. But at the end of the day, they were just, again, 8-8. Is that enough games even for the committee to really sink their teeth into? I know that was an issue for a couple of teams during the earlier reveals, and are they going to be able to really dig into a schedule that's not as robust as some others? I don't know. I don't know if that's going to be the reason Notre Dame gets left out, if they in fact do get left out. But there are moments when I watch Notre Dame and say, wow, like for instance, when Olivia Miles got into the lineup, I thought she makes them different. She adds an element they didn't have before. This is going to mean something. And then from a result standpoint, it really didn't ultimately. I still think they're a better team. I still think she adds a lot. I think she's going to be a superstar. In 2 years, she's going to be one of the 5 players we talk about all the time. But I think from a result standpoint, this year it didn't ultimately translate. And I don't know if that means enough to get Notre Dame in.
Yeah, no, I think if you look kind of at the metrics over the course of the whole season, right, we have them, I think, 92nd in her hoops stats rating, and I think the net has them, the net a little higher on them. They're 56 there. But I think that it's an interesting question. Like, what do you do when if these teams that had someone like an early enrollee and hopefully got better, should you be evaluating them just on since Miles got there, or because that's what the team is today? We had an article that our Jen Hatfield wrote about all the early enrollees, and she and I'm always gonna mispronounce her name, Van Olhoffen, right? For Oregon State, also had a huge impact. And so, how much do you, is that a case where we should be, giving a little bit of recency bias, which normally I would encourage not to. And again, I think the criteria that the committee uses, and Charlie knows better than anyone, right? It's not just the net, right? It's I think the net's one of 13. I was trying to look it up while we were talking and see what all the other ones are. But, I think that's
16 pieces of criteria that they look at?
14 is the number.
We all slightly disagree.
We had it surrounded there.
Yeah. So, which, I mean, I think you brought this point up too, Debbie. Some level you could argue that's too many, and it lets you kind of pick and choose the one you want when you want to make your argument, right? And if you value both conference record and overall record, then what does that mean about how you're valuing non-conference record? Because they all kind of add together. So I think that as much as I'd love to see Notre Dame in, it's a little hard to construct that. I'll definitely defer to Charlie for that argument, but I'm going to be fascinated to see how some of these teams with, that have been picking up steam of late get evaluated, and whether they're willing to, move a team that hasn't been one of the 64 best all season. Maybe they've been the 75th, but they're the 50th best team now, or you understand with the bubble. Mostly focused on that.
Same with teams trending the other way. That up here and are starting to trend the opposite way. Not the right time to do so. Right, it's the wrong time to be losing games.
Yeah, and I'm a little harsh. In that I really do think it should be about what's happening now, which is a little rough, right, for everyone that benefits. As you said, it's a zero-sum game, and so it definitely hurts someone else. And if there's COVID pause or illness or something, right? But if we're going to give, once you start saying like, well, they had someone out for that game, whether it's Cunane was out for one of the NC State games, right, or Gonzaga wasn't at full strength and barely beat a team yesterday that is not currently in the tournament, according to Charlie. Then you're sort of picking and choosing your data points, and so you got to think about how to do that systematically. And so, even though I don't love the idea of doing it by an algorithm, like that's the one point. At least like everybody understands, like we're just going to do it by the net. Like this is the rules. Let's be transparent about what those rules are and how they actually really calculate the net, so you can understand it. But at least then you all know where you're standing. I think the key is that transparency ahead of time.
Charlie, you have anything that you'd like to add or finish off and take us home here?
Just this tournament is going to be obviously like something we haven't ever seen. I think it's more wide open at the top this year than in my memory. I think that's great. I think that's wonderful for the sport. I'm interested to see how teams handle this environment. It's one that it's been a strict environment all season for everybody, but this is going to be a different environment. It's going to be a different way of being strict. And for teams that make the Final Four, you're looking at 3 weeks almost of being in kind of this isolation. And I hate to even bring this up, but I guess got my fingers crossed that nothing happens to a team once the tournament starts, that somebody doesn't test positive or contact trace, and that all of a sudden, like that, the team's season is over when maybe we're headed to the Sweet 16 or something like that. I'm just on my knees praying that does not happen. I'm going to keep a positive outlook. It's not going to happen. We're going to have a great tournament, and like I said, wide open at the top. We talk about a team like Baylor, who I have on the 2 line, and very, very easily could win the national championship. It's not every year that we say a 2 or 3 seed would necessarily even have a chance of winning the national championship, and maybe not even having a great chance of making the Final Four. So I'm very much looking forward to that and seeing how the teams handle this. And it might not be ultimately the best team. It's going to be the team that performs the best in this unique situation that ends up the national champion.
Aaron, your final thoughts, and where can people locate you?
Sure. Yeah. For my final thoughts, I largely echo Charlie's. I think that it's just so exciting that we finally made it to March. The tournament's around the corner. It's definitely wide open. And, I felt like a little earlier in the season, I was a little concerned that maybe the NCAA season didn't have quite as much juice in December in particular. People just didn't seem to be talking about it as much as I remember. But now you can definitely see it's been building, right? More games have been kind of featured on ESPN and other networks. And so I think the momentum is building, and it's just going to be remarkable, right? And in a one-game tournament, a winner-take-all kind of tournament, the best team doesn't always win, right? And this year, as you said, Charlie, I think more than any other, it's going to be fascinating to see how the teams kind of deal with the different challenges. As far as where to follow us and our work, probably the easiest thing to do, really on all social platforms, we're at HerHoopStats, HerHoopStats, or you can go to herhoopstats.com. That's our stats site, which is kind of our core work that we kind of started out on and then kind of expanded into the journalism. And yeah, we're going to have lots of great coverage for the tournament and beyond, right? WNBA season around the corner as well. All kinds of salary cap information we have there, as well as stats about the WNBA. So definitely invite everybody to come join us and help us help you enjoy the tournament.
Well, like you guys, I'm excited about the tournament as well. And I think that based on, since you brought the WNBA up, Aaron, we had some of the best metrics coming out of the WNBA, highest field goal percentage, 3-point percentage in a controlled bubble environment. And I'm expecting the same thing out of the NCAA women's tournament. I think we will have teams that play at their highest level and that they will be rested. And I think once you get to the Sweet 16, I do believe the NCAA will provide some sort of entertainment for the players in a controlled environment, so they won't just be locked up in their hotel rooms all that time. I think it's going to work out great. I have full confidence that the tournament is going to be run in a first-class, safe and a safe manner where everyone knows health and safety will be the primary concern. But we're going to get to crown a champion, and I think back in the fall, I'm not sure anybody really thought we could get to this point. So, to all the players and coaches and all the athletes out there, all the staff, all the testing, everything that's taken place, all the things that we've had to do testing, to make sure that we're all in compliance. I think it's going to make for a great, exciting look at the tournament, and I can't wait. And I can't thank you guys enough for spending some time.
Amen, Deb. Let's have a great tournament. Can't wait for it. Absolutely can't wait.
Indeed. Thanks a lot. I'm really looking forward to seeing both of you on my TV quite a bit.